So if we could dim the lights a little bit, I'll get started here. The first thing I wanted to do was sort of a history lesson. Everybody, I'm sure, was familiar that this was the 50th anniversary of the first moon landing, Apollo 11, back in July. But today is actually the 50th anniversary of the return of Apollo 12, the second mission of the Apollo moon landing series. And today is when, or November 20th, is when they launched off the moon to start their trip back to Earth. And so I wanted to just do a quick overview of that, because Apollo 11 got a lot of media attention, and I think the average person on the street probably assumes that's the only time we went to the moon. But in fact, there were 6 landings on the moon between 1969 and 1972. So some people say that Apollo 12 was actually the first mission of exploration to the moon. Apollo 11 was essentially a proof of concept. And it was get there, put footprints on the surface, grab a few rocks, and get yourself back home. This was the first mission where they actually had goals that required very precise landing in a particular area, and they had some more time on the surface. And so here's the crew. Let's see if I can figure this out. So Pete Conrad, Dick Gordon, and Alan Bean were the 3 astronauts. So Dick Gordon was the command module pilot. He stayed in lunar orbit in the command module. Alan Bean and Pete Conrad were the 2 moonwalkers. And so, maybe, here we go. So this is a sort of a short movie recapping the highlights of Apollo 12. All right, come on. So Apollo 12 had the distinction of being struck by lightning right after liftoff. They launched in the middle of a thunderstorm. And amazingly, they were able to recover very quickly from what could have been a disastrous situation.
Apollo 12 Houston, try FCE to auxiliary, over. FCE to auxiliary. What the hell is that? FCE to auxiliary. Apollo 12 Houston, try to reset your fuel cells now.
Okay, I have a good GDC, and Al has got the fuel cells back on, and we'll be working on our AC buses.
So the one goal of...
May have been a small one for Neil, but that's a long one for me.
I love that quote. Pete Conrad was about the shortest astronaut in the whole Corps at the time, so... And so this would have been on November 20th back in 1969.
3, 2, 1, mark. Hello, Houston. Apollo 12, approved home. We're getting a spectacular view of Eclipse.
right, so I wanted to show a few just slides to give you a little bit of a more idea of what this mission was all about. So the precision landing part of this was back in the mid-60s, we had a series of spacecraft called Surveyor. They were unmanned spacecraft, and they were designed to land on the surface, test out what the surface properties were, make sure that something like Apollo could successfully land on the surface. There was a lot of thought that the surface of the moon would be covered tens of meters deep with very fine dust, and when you tried to land on it, you'd just sink. And so the surveyors proved that that wasn't the case. So the idea was to prove that we could do these precision landings with Apollo is they wanted to go to Surveyor 3, which had landed in 1967, so 2.5 years before Apollo 12, and retrieve some samples from it. So it had been sitting on the surface in vacuum for 2.5 years, and this would be a chance to see how electronics survived the day-night temperature swings, the solar radiation, the dust environment, and all that. So this was Pete Conrad. The lunar module landed 500 feet away, and so they cut off the main camera system and the sample scoop. It had sort of a little backhoe on the end, and brought those back to Earth. So first of all, this is just a close-up. There was some thinking when Surveyor landed, they had some indication that it actually bounced several times. And once they got there, you can actually see the footprints from it bouncing across the surface. And so here's the camera that they brought back. That's in a clean room in Houston at the Manned Space Flight Center. And here's the sample scoop. One of the amazing things, and I think people are still scratching their heads a bit, is when they tore into these things, inside the insulation of these wires, they actually found bacteria, and it was alive. And so that proved that, they're not thinking it was lunar bacteria, but they did very little to sterilize these spacecraft, and so there were bacteria that had survived on the surface of the moon for 2.5 years, and that was certainly not what was expected. So on the 24th of November, the command module landed in the Pacific Ocean, and I'm not sure if those of you that were around during Apollo remember, but there was a lot of concern that maybe there were bugs on the surface of the moon, and we didn't want the astronauts to bring contagion back from the moon. So when Apollo 11 landed, they threw in these sort of hazmat suits, opened the hatch, threw those in, closed the hatch. The astronauts put these on. They jumped out into the life raft, got picked up by a helicopter, dumped on the aircraft carrier, and then they got put in an Airstream trailer and closed up. They flew the trailer to Houston, and they were in a quarantine facility for 3 weeks to make sure they didn't get sick. So they didn't, and Apollo 12, they decided, well, we still need to do this, but let's not be so stringent, and so they just put face masks on. In that case, I guess they don't care if you transmit it by touch. So here's getting off the helicopter. There's the Airstream trailer on the right, and the little sign, if you can see it, says 3 more like before. And they closed them in and did the same 3-week quarantine, but that was Pete Conrad, Dick Gordon, and Alan Bean. So that was a very successful mission, and I think over the course of the next 2 years, we'll for each one of the Apollo landing missions, we'll try to do this because we've got 4 more to go.